And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Greetings, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska marine weather. That'll take us into the early week ahead. In the meantime, though, first let's look at the sea ice edge. And we do have ice building along areas of the Arctic coast, extending back toward the Mackenzie River there along the Canadian Arctic coast, the Russian coast, and then down along areas of Kotzebue, Norton Sound, as well as along the YK Delta. Still early season ice, and we expect that to be gradually increasing. There are some signs maybe we could see a shot of colder air by next weekend, work its way from north to south as we get past the time change coming up next weekend. But in the meantime, we are watching a low pressure system in the central Bering lift slowly to the north-northwest into the Gulf of Anadyr. And this occluded front weakening as it pushes further north and east and into the western interior with a little bit of light precipitation, nothing too terribly heavy. There's another low in the Gulf that's not very strong as well. And as we go into Monday, that feature just kind of sits there with some light precipitation, especially along the Gulf Coast, and the front makes further progress into the western interior during the day on Monday. And by the time we get into Tuesday, we'll see that low push up into the Chukchi Sea from off the Russian coast with the front weakened trough pushing into the interior. And then area of low pressure down here across the North Pacific is actually going to track more to the northwest than coming further northward up into the Gulf. In fact, as we get into midweek, Wednesday, Thursday, we're going to have more of an easterly flow across the Gulf and much of the mainland. And so that pattern will not bring about much in the way of any adverse weather or big storms in the short term. So looking at the southeast panhandle for Monday for the inner channels, winds southeast 10 to 15 knots, waves generally a couple of feet from Lynn Canal through Stevens Passage and Dixon Entrance. Outer coast winds could be 25 to 30 knots southeast to east, with waves 10 to 13 feet, as high as 15 feet over toward Cape Suckling. And then on Tuesday, winds do come down across Lynn Canal, variable 5 knots, waves a foot or two east, southeast winds 10 knots from Stevens Passage down in through Ketchikan and Metlakatla. Further westward here along the outer coast within 15 nautical miles of shore, we're looking for easterly winds 15 to 20 knots with waves generally running 7 to 8 feet. Northwestern Gulf winds will be northerly within Prince William Sound at 10 knots with waves a couple of feet. The outer coast off of the Kenai, 20-25 knots, waves right around 10-11 feet. And through Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds at 15 to 20 knots, waves 4 to as high as 7 feet off of Anchor Point and down toward the entrance there west of Homer. And for Tuesday, winds within Prince William Sound, northeasterly 10 knots, waves a couple of feet. Off the Kenai coast, winds will be out of the northeast at 20 knots, 7-foot waves. And then down the length of Cook Inlet, look for north winds 15 knots there around Kenai. But as we get down toward Anchor Point and toward the entrance of Cook Inlet, 20-knot northeasterly winds with waves running 6-7 feet. On Monday, winds will be northeasterly 15 to 20 knots across Kodiak Island, waves 7 feet within Shelikof Strait. And as we progress down the peninsula, we are looking for winds to be variable around 10 knots, 4 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side and 3 to 4 feet on the Bering side. Come Tuesday, winds will generally be out of the northeast across much of the region, 20 to 25 knots, highest there within Shelikof Strait, 10-foot waves. Otherwise, 15 to 20 knot northeasterly winds, waves 5-6 feet on the North Pacific side and 3 to 4 feet from Bristol Bay down to north of Cold Bay. And across the Aleutian chain, Monday, winds will be northerly in eastern Aleutians 15 knots, variable and then more westerly as you get up north and west of Adak. And winds will pick back up to about 20-25 knots from the south-southwest once you get out towards Shemya. Waves generally 5 to 6 feet on the North Pacific side and 5 to 6 feet on the Barren side. And winds will be across the eastern Aleutians on Tuesday will be out of the north-northeast at 15 knots, turning back around to the south from Atka, Adak westward, and then eventually you get a little bit of a circulation there with winds turning back to the west at 25 knots there. Kiska on up towards Shemya, and waves 4 to 5 feet here across the eastern central Aleutians, generally the rule. And looking at the southwest coast within Bristol Bay, winds will be out of the east at 10 knots, 2 foot waves. Look for southwest winds in Kuskokwim Bay at 10 knots and waves 2 feet. Along the Yukon Delta and south side of Norton Sound, winds will be south at 15 to 20 knots, waves generally running a few feet. And for Tuesday, expect variable winds around St. Matthew, St. Paul at 10 knots, waves a few feet there. Offshore northeast flow to 10 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay, and northeast winds 15 knots out of Bristol Bay with waves a couple of feet. South winds continue at about 10 to 15 knots along the lower Yukon Delta coast there with 2 to 3 foot waves. Now on the north side of St. Lawrence Island and south of the Bering Strait, Monday winds will be out of the southeast at 20 knots, waves 4 or 5 feet. As we get up in the lower Chukchi, look for southeast to east winds at 20 to 25 knots all the way up to Wainwright with waves 4 to 6 feet. And then along the Arctic coast, winds will be northeast to east at 15 to 20 knots with waves of 3 to 4 feet. And finally on Tuesday, winds along the Arctic coast will generally be out of the east at 15 to 20 knots with 3 to 4 foot waves. Those easterly winds as high as 25 knots there around Wainwright with 5 foot waves, and then winds turn more southerly once you get through the lower Chukchi Sea at 15 to 20 knots with waves of 3 to 4 feet. And look for southerly 20 knot winds with waves 4 to 5 feet there just west of Wales, Port Clarence, and on the north side of St. Lawrence Island.